You wake up one morning, you go to make breakfast, and suddenly the fuel you need to cook is gone. It's scarce and it's expensive. Well, that's exactly what happened all across India. A conflict thousands of miles away sent this massive shockwave that triggered a huge cooking gas crisis, and it turned millions of lives upside down almost overnight.
And this quote, wow, this just says it all, doesn't it? This isn't just about prices on a spreadsheet. This is a tiffin worker in Hyderabad whose entire livelihood is suddenly on the brink. It's the sound of a kitchen falling silent. For so many people, the price didn't just go up a little bit, it shot into the stratosphere, completely out of reach.
So that brings us to the big question, right? How on earth does something happening so far away cause such immediate chaos right here at home? It seems almost unbelievable, but what we're about to see is just how connected and how fragile our world really is.
All right, so to really get this, we need to look at a map. We need to find the one single trigger point that started this whole chain reaction. And it all begins in this tiny, narrow stretch of water over in West Asia.
This is it, the Strait of Hormuz. You can think of it as a massive superhighway for the world's energy. So when a military conflict flared up in the region, this superhighway got disrupted. All of a sudden, tankers carrying LPG, the cooking gas for hundreds of millions of Indian homes, they just couldn't get through. And for India, this wasn't just some small inconvenience, this was a direct threat to its energy security.
And when you look at the numbers, you really see just how vulnerable the situation was. 60% of the country's cooking gas is imported. Okay, that's a lot. But then look at this. A whopping 90% of those imports have to pass through that one single choke point. So when that route gets squeezed, the lifeline to India's kitchens gets squeezed right along with it.
So as you can imagine, news of this disruption spread like wildfire, and what came next was a textbook case of a supply shock. It wasn't just about the gas not being there yet. It was the fear of it running out that sent the entire country into a panic.
And the scenes on the ground, they were just chaotic. From West Bengal all the way to Gujarat, people were scrambling to get their hands on a gas cylinder. You had these incredibly long queues forming outside distribution centers, sometimes before dawn, as this wave of anxiety just swept across the country.
And we're not talking about a small spike in demand. It was huge. Booking volumes for gas cylinders jumped by nearly 10 times. The digital systems we all rely on, the apps, the websites, even WhatsApp booking, they just couldn't handle it. They kept crashing over and over, which of course just made people even more anxious.
And this is where you see the real human cost. Server down. That message was everywhere. People were spending hours and hours in line, and there were even reports of people fainting from exhaustion just waiting. The fear wasn't just about cooking dinner tonight. It was, how long is this going to last? Getting a basic necessity had turned into this daily, exhausting struggle.
And this crisis didn't just stop at people's homes. Oh no, it rippled out everywhere, affecting everything from those bustling street food stalls in Mumbai to the quiet university campuses.
See, commercial gas supplies were one of the first things to get cut, and in a city like Mumbai, that meant the familiar sizzle of vada pav and samosas just started to fade away. It was a huge blow to the food industry. In Kerala, there were warnings that up to 40% of restaurants could be forced to close. Others had to slash their menus by as much as 70%.
And listen to this quote from a student in Pune. It's just heartbreaking. As university messes and hostels ran out of gas, their meals became really repetitive, really basic. Students were literally surviving on just khichdi, day in and day out. It's such a stark reminder of how a big national crisis hits you on a personal level, affecting what you eat, how you study, just your basic well-being.
And the dominoes just kept falling. Schools couldn't run their canteens, so they had to ask parents to pack lunches. Those vital midday meal programs for kids were at risk. And then you have these impacts you'd never even think of, like Bengaluru's craft beer industry. They needed LPG for their boilers, so production had to stop. Even the famous Darjeeling tea industry was sounding the alarm.
But in the middle of all this chaos, people and the government didn't just sit there and wait. They had to adapt. And the way they responded was this really fascinating mix of the very old and the very new.
You had this really interesting split reaction. On one hand, people were kind of going back in time, right? A temporary return to older, dirtier fuels like kerosene, coal, even firewood. It felt like a step backward. But at the very same time, you had this massive leap forward, with a huge rush to buy modern electric cooking gadgets. And when I say a massive leap, I am not kidding. The demand for things like induction cooktops went through the roof. According to one report, sales shot up an incredible 25 times over the normal rate in just 2 days. That just shows you the level of desperation to find any reliable way to cook a meal.
Okay, so the government had to step in, and they had to do it fast. They rolled out this multi-step plan to try and get a handle on the crisis. First, they prioritized supply to the most essential places: homes, hospitals, schools. Then they made alternatives like kerosene more available. They launched crackdowns on anyone hoarding or selling on the black market. And finally, they tried to manage demand by spacing out how often people could book a cylinder.
Well, as you can probably guess, with a crisis this big, it was only a matter of time before it spilled out of the kitchen and into the political arena. And yeah, it turned into a pretty fierce blame game.
So here you have the government's official stance, coming from Prime Minister Modi himself. The message was basically, everyone stay calm. This is a global problem, we're handling it, and some people are just using this to create panic for their own reasons. The focus was really on reassurance and trying to stop the panic from spreading.
But the opposition immediately fired back. Their argument, like this one from MP Karti Chidambaram, was pretty straightforward. You can't just tell people not to panic if they can't actually get gas. They pointed to what they saw as a huge gap between the government's official statements and the reality people were facing in those long queues.
And they didn't just use words. They used some pretty powerful political theater to make their point. You had these protests where opposition parties would literally set up traditional wood-fired stoves, chulas, and make tea right there in public. It created this really strong visual message, basically saying, look at what your policies are forcing people to go back to. And all of this leaves us with one final really important question. Was this whole thing just a temporary blip? A perfect storm of a distant conflict and some panic at home? Or was it something more? A huge flashing red warning light about India's deep reliance on unpredictable global energy supplies. The queues might be gone for now, but the questions this crisis brought up about the country's energy security, well, those aren't going away anytime soon.